I like the talk already. So next up, we are glad to have Jim Goetz, a partner at Sequoia Capital.
A round of applause for venture capitalists. Honored to be here, honored to be here. The term venture capital, I think, inspires all kinds of emotion. It certainly did for me 20 years ago. A couple skeptics in the room. Yeah. Maybe a hater or two. I'm sorry, can you hear me now? No? We'll crank that up. My apologies. Venture capital, venture capitalists probably inspires emotion. I was certainly a skeptic 20 years ago. In fact, if I could just spend a minute telling a personal story. I was in a room not unlike this over at the GSB. I was in the engineering program, and we had learned at the campus union that there was going to be a talk on entrepreneurship. Now, the guys in the business school didn't want the engineers to show up. They made it very clear to us that we were not welcome. But a few of us snuck in, stood in the back, kind of like you folks back there. And we listened to Ken Ashman and Bob Maxfield talk about entrepreneurship and their experience with Roll. They're the O and the M in Rollman. Ken, who was a spectacular entrepreneur, recently passed away. But they created an emotion and energy and vibration, much like what you feel today. Most of us walked out amped and jacked. And at that moment in time, I decided I wanted to start a company. Didn't know when, didn't think I was ready. But I knew that the two of them had lived a very different life, a legendary life. And I think that opportunity is here with all of you today. So in 1996, with Monty Kirsten, I started a company called Vital Signs. Thanks to Mark Andreessen and the work he did with Netscape, there was an incredible amount of frustration in connecting to the internet. Much like driving today down 280 and trying to complete a voice call, people were frustrated with connecting over broadband or dial-up. And we decided there was an opportunity to build something that would characterize end-user performance of the network and the applications from your perspective. Launched a consumer company that had a product called NetMedic and later Vital Agent that targeted the consumer and hoped to diagnose and solve some of these problems that had created an enormous friction in the environment. Now, I was enamored with blue. You can see that from the early website. I had to go back to the Wayback Machine to pull this out. And clearly, the artistic skills were not in place. But we bootstrapped. Later, we took angel funding. We didn't have the super angel Ron Conway as visible at the time. We actually took capital from some of our mentors at a company called Synoptics. And later, we had the good fortune of getting into business with Sequoia Capital and Austin Ventures. It was a spectacular journey. We wound up accepting an acquisition offer 4 years later. A couple $100 million, a bittersweet decision, but by far the best 4 years of my life. And I hope all of you will also take the plunge. So I'm going to spend most of my time trying to provide a perspective from Sequoia. I'd like to talk about founders, ideas, and the idea, and timing. Is it too late? What about this recession? We've had the good fortune over the last 40 years to be involved with some spectacular, iconic brands. A lot of discussion around Steve Jobs in the last couple of weeks, and I won't spend time revisiting that. But every one of these brands has touched a number of us in a meaningful way. Whether it's a consumer or enterprise company, all of us look up to these legendary founders, and in a way, it creates a level of intimidation. I remember listening to Ken Ashman and Bob Maxfield in awe 15, 20 years ago. One of the things I didn't fully appreciate at the time is every one of these spectacular entrepreneurs started out as an unknown underdog. Very humble beginnings. It's something that Don Valentine spends a lot of time chatting about within the partnership, has for the better part of 40 years. The spectacular companies start with people like yourself. Ambitious, intelligent, unknown, and underdogs. No fancy pedigree. And take a look at some of the shots. And look at Max, who you're going to hear from later today, in the middle. Those glasses, fresh out of Illinois. Or Jerry and David. Or Larry and Sergey. Down on the right, Omar Hamoy. I'm guessing there's some faces you don't recognize. A little less intimidating now. In fact, Larry Page is back as CEO of Google. It's a role that he started in with Sergey some time earlier. Most of you used Google sometime this morning, and if not last night. It's something that touches us every day. But it's a company that started against the backdrop of Excite, Lycos, Yahoo owned search. In fact, you'd argue that the environment was too crowded. We didn't need another search engine. There were lots of folks cruising up and down Sand Hill Road talking about another search engine, but there were already too many. Larry, I think at 12, was ready to be an inventor or an entrepreneur. He took time while in the Stanford PhD program to really dig in on the World Wide Web. Kicked off a program called Backrub, based out of personal frustration in the relevance of search. Just the amount of garbage that had actually showed up in these search engines over time. But he did it in a way that was quite unique. He had a point of view that was very different from the existing ecosystem. He recognized through his work in academia that citations in research work often pointed back to a couple of seminal documents. And as he looked at the crawling that was occurring across the web, he recognized that these backlinks or pointers was something that could be leveraged to create relevance. And out of that project, Backrub became PageRank. And he took a shot at changing the ecosystem. He didn't listen to folks that said you can't do it, there are too many search engines. Yahoo's already there, Lycos, Alta Vista. He went and saw John Doerr, who's in the audience, along with Michael Moritz. Ron Conway was kind enough to connect all of us. And they took off as a company, focused on the enterprise. Failed initially, and John gets up here later today. I hope he talks about that experience. But the founders of Google were tenacious. They continued their march towards impacting relevance. They redefined what it meant to hire A players. They were students of economics. So they actually brought in a gentleman named Hal Varian who spent a lot of time talking about how to create an ecosystem and a marketplace and auction dynamics. And as they created this 10x improvement in relevance, they realized with targeting they could actually share the economics with the advertisers and the publishers. They were generous. They built a spectacular ecosystem. You were able to acquire customers more effectively on Google, and you were able to drive a higher eCPM if you're a publisher. But they started very modestly. Cisco is another company that started right here on this campus. It's a company today that will probably do close to $40 billion this year. Outrageous net margins. In the 90s, it was the Facebook, the Google of that time. Most of you were either in elementary school or a thought in your parents' mind when this company was started by two students. Sandy was, at the time, the manager of the computer lab here at Stanford for the business school. Len was a grad student in computer science who was interested in networks. There's a project that was started here on campus to actually connect maybe 500 different networks. And the two of them intersected at that point in time. A great deal of energy was spent on trying to connect the Banyan Vines environment to the SNA environment to the DECnet environment, and they used TCP/IP to pull it all together in what was considered a multi-protocol router. They could not get funding for their concept. They cobbled together, I mean, you can't make this shit up. Look at that router. They cobbled together with spare parts the very first set of products. They went out and eventually recognized that enterprises also had this problem. They wanted to connect networks or network networks. It's ironic that at the time they struggled with financing because people were worried about market size. It's a company that does tens of billions of dollars at this point in time in the enterprise and in the carrier space. They had a huge impact on the culture. So if you spend any time at Cisco, anybody here from Cisco? Frugality, enormous focus on customer service are a reflection of Sandy and Lynn and what was important to the two of them as they set Cisco aloft. LinkedIn. How many of you are actually on LinkedIn with a profile? Outstanding. Well, you've all heard from Reed in the past. Reed is a spectacular entrepreneur. We first intersected with Reed while he was at PayPal. Reed actually had a failure before PayPal. A lot of people don't know this. There was a company called SocialNet. Online dating. I don't know if he talks about it much. But Reed was into social long before the Facebook or any number of the early sites, Tribe, Friendster. Had an enormous focus and energy personally on networking. And in fact, I'm guessing that Reed's touched a number of you over the course of the last couple of years. Reed is a phenomenal angel investor, but he also had a personal passion around creating a system that connect people professionally. And after that first experience with SocialNet, he realized that hiring was a critical component and that a professional network and a professional social graph could be compelling. He's a student of virality, probably knows more about the human dimension in terms of driving game mechanics than just about everybody combined in the venture ecosystem. And he was patient. You know, it turns out that LinkedIn was not an overnight success. LinkedIn, when we first intersected with the team, had roughly 30,000 users, and it had a lot of energy from Reed, who had wonderful background from PayPal and their ability to iterate against large competitors. But it took almost a decade to create a meaningful graph that's had an impact on society. Patience, tens of thousands of hours, a relentless focus, and a willingness to get something out early and iterate. Omar Hamoy. Failed twice. Mobile gaming, mobile photo sharing. He did this while he had children. He went off to business school at Wharton and realized that he probably ought to figure out why he was failing. After the first year, he started to scratch his head on the lack of the economy or economics for the mobile developer in the ecosystem. And he realized that the app developers at that point in time in mobile lacked a way to acquire customers. Freemium wasn't working. Too much friction, too much fragmentation with the carrier deck. He took a dramatically different approach than just about everybody else in the marketplace and decided he was going to ignore the brands, ignore the carriers, and focus on individual developers. Just one person. When we intersected with Omar and he explained to my partners that he wanted to focus on the long tail of one or two man mobile developers that in most cases were broke and starving, some of us wondered whether it was worth pursuing. But it was very clear he had an unconventional perspective on the ecosystem. We at one point in time wanted to send him down to AT&T and have him meet with the team, maybe get him on the carrier deck, and I begged Omar to buy a suit, and we put him on a plane to Atlanta, and it was very clear at that point in time, at a guttural level, he knew it was wrong. He had spent years struggling as a mobile developer in the application ecosystem and recognized that if he could cultivate an economy for the long tail of mobile developers, he was going to be able to build a meaningful company over time. Look at that first website. And look at the quote up there. Do any of you guys know Ian McCarthy? He had the courage to put something out early and iterate. He had personal pain. Last group of founders, Paul and Jessica, and their team. As we think about entrepreneurship, I reflect back on my experience 20 years ago where the students at the GSB tried to block us out of the room. This team has done more for entrepreneurship, to democratize and educate and crowdsource than just about anybody in the last couple of decades. So to Paul and Jessica, a round of applause for everything they've done. Common thread through all these founders. Sketchy, misfits, unknowns, all focused on personal pain, all were willing to put something out early and iterate. Magnet qualities when it came to recruiting a team, and relentless in their pursuit. Didn't happen overnight. All of you have the same characteristics. So rather than be intimidated by these icons and entrepreneurs that have come before you, I hope you gain inspiration and you walk out of here jacked and amped to become an entrepreneur, or at least join a company on your path to becoming an entrepreneur. The idea, or ideas. How many of you have actually come to the point where you've got an idea that you're ready to launch a company behind? Show of hands. How many of you have a handful of ideas and you're not sure which one you should choose? How many of you are still looking to find the personal experience and pain and discover the idea? As an entrepreneur, this may be the most difficult challenge for everybody in the room. And I find that entrepreneurs in general don't spend as much time as they should in the idea phase. One of your advantages as a young company or a one-man or two-man team is you can pressure test, validate, do due diligence, learn as much as you can about the opportunity. I think here's a couple of key requirements from Sequoia's perspective on an idea. I talked a little bit about the entrepreneurs, but these two keywords, unique and compelling. And it's very easy to convince yourself that it's unique and compelling if you're not intellectually honest. You need a unique and compelling point of view. You need to have enough confidence that you have an unfair advantage that as an upstart, you can break into a market and dominate. You're going to be asking people to join the company, to take risk, invest in your opportunity, and as you think about that, I'd encourage you to spend meaningful time pressure testing the idea. Now, it'd be nice to be able to map out where on these creative tensions you sit. Not suggesting for a moment there's a right or a wrong. We talked about Google, and it'd be easy to argue that they weren't the first mover. In fact, they were late. I think in the case of Google, though, they probably had a 10x advantage. And they weren't 30% better. There was an enormous order of magnitude improvement. And so as you think about your idea, I encourage you to pressure test it with the folks you have here, folks that are in the domain and have expertise, and ask yourself some critical questions on where you sit on that scale. And I think if you go back to personal passion and energy, I think you'll know. I think you'll know when you're ready and you've discovered and pressure tested and gained the conviction and confidence around the idea. I think when you get to that point, there's one last challenge, and that's how to distill and convey your personal and unique point of view to future employees, to prospects, to customers, and potentially investors. But even if you ignore the investment community and you're able to bootstrap and get cash flow positive, or amen positive, you have an opportunity to distill and energize a very concise and clear message around the company. And I'd encourage you to spend a month on that task. And Jeffrey Moore, who Mark mentioned earlier, pulled off a pretty wonderful and spectacular commentary in his positioning template. Okay, timing. A lot of you are concerned about the recession. Is it too late? The internet has come and gone. 40 years of history at Sequoia tells us it's a spectacular time to start a company. Market's in a downturn. We backed Cisco during Black Monday, where the market dropped 40%. LinkedIn, Dropbox were all invested in during downturns. The difficulty in recruiting that you're all currently contemplating is arguably addressed with the downturn. James talked about this, but just think about the economics of a startup. It's an order of magnitude different today than it was a decade ago to get a company off the ground. If you're a coder, you understand the impact of these open source efforts, and the distribution ecosystems that have evolved are dramatically different than what they were a decade ago. We are also witnessing a massive disruption. Mini to PC occurred about 30 years ago. It took the better part of a decade to get to 100 million users. With Mark and the Netscape phenomenon that created the web and the internet, we saw a meaningful uplift in that ramp. But mobile will get to 1 billion in half the time that we witness in the consumer internet. We're likely to see 10 billion sockets for all of you to sell into in the next 4 or 5 years. We'll probably hit 1 billion smartphones in the next 18 months. You get some great advice from Y Combinator and Paul Graham on focus on the end user, focus on your customer. But business models for all of you can be a weapon against the incumbents. Look at Salesforce and what they've done to Oracle in the CRM space over the last few years. In the mobile ecosystem, some of the most interesting opportunities are framed because Apple and Google are now in the middle of a battle that has all of them focused on you, the developer. They want to create an economy and a developer ecosystem because they both know that the platform battles that have occurred in the past, whether it be the PC or the web, were dominated by winning the developer community. Just to give you an idea, multinationals a decade ago used to spend the first 4 or 5 years of their global attempts trying to get to 20 or 30 countries. You can launch an application today in 150 tomorrow on the App Store. Staggering. There's also arbitrage in the ecosystem. So what used to be SEO and search are now leaderboards. And it turns out that there's not that much efficiency. It's now a challenge to kind of get above the noise of the app developers and show up on those leaderboards. And there are all kinds of innovation that's occurred. Zynga has taken advantage of arbitrage in Facebook and have propelled themselves into a wonderful position in the ecosystem. You'll hear from Mark later today. You also have companies like WhatsApp, Evernote, and Dropbox using a very different approach to winning users over. I'd encourage all of you to spend some time thinking about how you can use business models as a weapon. One final comment before I go to Q&A. We have something we call Supper at Sequoia. It's an event that we host in the fall, and we try to bring together the entrepreneurs that we've backed in the last 12 months, along with everybody that we work with historically, including folks like Ron Conway and others who have been a big part of our success over the years. And in that event in the last year, we spent a little time talking about RLPs. And we learned in the process of thanking our entrepreneurs for everything they've done in the last decade. And specifically, we've had a very good 2 years at Sequoia. This headline is just not accurate. Turns out that the vast majority of the impact that those entrepreneurs have created have actually gone to a number of spectacular causes. A list of LPs that Don Valentine has curated over the last couple of decades with a focus on wanting to have a long-term impact on society. And I share that with all of you because it was very clear from the session at supper where the typical interaction is hazing the newer entrepreneurs, learning a little bit about the class of 2011 or the hopefully future class of 2012, and talking a little bit about some of the challenges that we face from an entrepreneurship perspective. Hoping we'll have an opportunity to work with a handful of you who have an ambition to build an enduring company and have you participate in something that gets us jacked up as we come into the office every day, having an impact beyond just Silicon Valley. Okay, questions. Can I take any questions? Can I stir the pot a little bit? Ask something difficult? I will. Sure, in the back. So the question framed the amount of capital going into Series A, especially with the cost of starting a company dropping dramatically. Look, I think it's up to the entrepreneur. I think you're in a wonderful situation today. There's a lot of capital in the environment, as most of you know. And given valuations, I think some folks are open to raising more, thinking about potentially bypassing a Series B. I often find that when a company raises more capital than needed, they lose some discipline in the culture. And you start to see some behavior that arguably creates dynamics within the organization that may not be the proper foundation for a long-term enduring business. And we discourage, if possible, our teams from raising too much money too early. And as time marches on and you create more value, you're typically going to be in a situation that's less dilutive. But it's hard to fault some of these young folks given the valuation environment and a concern that things might disappear in terms of the interest from the various investors. So the question was, do Sequoia think the company needs to be in the Valley to be successful? Absolutely not. I mean, there's a number of companies that are part of the portfolio that are not in Silicon Valley. We think there's an unfair advantage if you're starting an early stage company to build out a team right here. And in general, most of our energy in the business is centered around trying to find a dozen or so spectacular entrepreneurs every year that are looking to build an enduring business, and probably 80% of what we do is right here. But Omar Hamoy is a great exception. Omar was in Philadelphia when we intersected with him, and we did encourage him over a few month period of time to come and join us in the Valley, and he did.
I guess on the last slide you talked about some of the causes, that you guys have done, like things you've done for like nonprofits, things like that, and that's what you're saying, these are the great things we're doing. I work with a startup that deals with nonprofits, and we find it like kind of hard for people to take it seriously. They're like, oh, you're never going to be able to make as much money as this and that. But in the end, it's like, I don't know. It seems like a lot of people are kind of against. You're saying like, the end goal. Look at all these things we've done, but it's hard to get people to kind of take it seriously in that regard. Like, I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
So to frame the question for the broader group, I think you're wondering about the not-for-profits. And want a little bit more context. Look, I think the term venture capitalists, we're in the end going to be sharing a goal, I think, with most of you to build a profitable business. But we're in a fortunate situation where we've been able to choose our LPs over several decades. And I think with Don Valentine's focus around wanting to have an impact, we've curated that list and decided to the extent that we're in an ecosystem where with entrepreneurs like you, there can be an enormous impact in terms of actual return. We'd like to think that a big portion of it go back to these institutions that have a very long-term perspective. It turns out that most of the folks that I focused on have a long-term view. They're not impatient, they're not looking for a return tomorrow, and they're wonderful LPs. And when the market goes down, some people disappear. That's never happened with this group of LPs. And so there's a number of wonderful reasons why we chose that group, but we feel great about them as partners and just wanted to share some of the good work that they've done with the returns. couple more questions.
What was either the hardest or the worst part for you about changing from an engineering role to a
Hardest part about the transition from an entrepreneurial role to venture, the human dimension. I love being part of a team. I mean, I feel the energy in the room here today. It's just so spectacular to be around a team dynamic where you're thinking about taking the hill together, the cadence of the weekly, the monthly, the quarterly successes, and competing in the marketplace. It's hard to fulfill that same human connection as an investor. We have a wonderful team of partners, and I enjoy spending time with them on Monday and Tuesday. But it's a little different being a coach or a consigliere. And I miss, my wife points out all the time, the 4 years that I had as an entrepreneur. It was by far the most enjoyable at a human level, and it was the connection with the team.
It's tough for someone from outside the United States to create the needs for entrepreneurship. So is VC doing something to push government to make it easy for people to contribute?
So I think you're talking about the immigration challenges, is that correct? So I think the question is what's happening with the current challenges with immigration? And are we doing anything to push? Probably no area that gets more attention from Kleiner and Sequoia and a number of other venture firms with the folks in Washington than the need to keep an open mind when it comes to entrepreneurs in immigration. Over half the folks that we have backed are immigrants. Some of the most spectacular entrepreneurs that have been part of this Valley ecosystem were not born here. And so it's an area of passion and focus, and we're continuing to apply pressure whenever possible. I'll take one more question. This is dangerous.
Omar told me that he got his term sheet in less than 24 hours after he did his presentation. How fast should entrepreneurs expect to hear yes or no? And do they hear no ever?
By the laughter, I guess I don't need to repeat that question. We are, in general, prepared to move quickly as a partnership. And in the case of Omar Hamoy, there was a competitive dynamic that forced us to do diligence in a very short period of time. In general, it takes a few weeks for us to do due diligence. And we'd like to make sure that you feel great about Sequoia as a potential partner. And we'd like to have time to get to know you, your team, and the personal passion and market entry strategy that you pull together. The last question, if I could just address it, and I think this is one of the mysteries of venture, is do we hear no? In general, we try to be transparent with the entrepreneurs. We've also been there, and I think in general, our hope is that you'll find a path and you'll get financing, and we try to be transparent with the entrepreneur whenever possible. Final comment. I don't know the path that the group's going to take over the course of the next few years. But I'm hopeful, given that you're here today, that all of you will think about participating in a startup, joining a management team of a young company, or possibly founding, starting a company of your own. It was by far the best experience of my life, and I'm hoping you'll come join the folks that we backed in the last couple of years. And if you're interested in building an enduring business, we'd love to serve you. We'd love to have the opportunity to be your partner, to work hard, and to help you pursue your dream. Thank you.